Ed is going to be introducing our speaker.
I've known Paul since 1958. My chance to roast him now and tell some lies and true stories about him. They're both of them about the same. But Paul was from, well, actually he was born in Wichita, Kansas, but went and lived in Topeka, Kansas, and graduated in 1958, same time I graduated from high school. Went to Rice University, both of us, because our names were so similar, Ebel and Ebel, alphabetically. The Navy, ROTC, matched us together wherever we went. So he was a CEO of the Precision Drill Team, and I was the EXO Precision Drill Team, for example. And in all of the summer cruises we went on every year, we were together. So we know each other probably too well, and he's the best friend I have. Don't want to tear up here. But Paul, he was on 2 nuclear submarines. He went straight from commissioning to the George C. Marshall Boomer submarine, where he was reactor officer. And then he was on an attack submarine for I forgot how many years, where he was the actual chief engineer on the attack submarine. And I can't remember the name of it right now, I don't know why, but anyway. Guardfish, how could I forget a guardfish? Because that's what they do, they're fast attack submarines. And I'd like to introduce real quickly here Bruce Vaney, sitting at our table over here where Paul and I were. He was also on 2 nuclear submarines. Thank you, on 2 fast attack submarines. So we have a lot of experience at that table. Plus we have another guest here that was also on a bunch of submarines. So we have a lot of experts here to fact check Paul to be sure he's telling the truth. After Paul was, after 7 years, he then left the service and joined the Allied General Nuclear Incorporated facility down in Savannah River Project area. And I can't tell you what they do there because he'd have to kill us. But the other company he then worked for from, I guess, 1983 until more recently was BEI Corporation, which was really his company. He was vice president of that, another nuclear facility. Paul was for many years, since 2005, I guess, the agent from the U.S. nuclear facility and nuclear agency to the International Atomic Energy Commission. And he was developing manuals and training manuals for all the nuclear plants, how to be safe and how to watch your culture when you're there. And Paul then was the expert, therefore he went around the world and visited 70 countries and trained and gave lectures to all these guys all over the world. He's been to every stand country there is. And he claims to have over 4 million Delta frequent fire miles. And so he always, I only have 3, so I'm always feeling pretty sorry about that. But one thing happened with Paul and I. I was going to be going from a flight from Atlanta on Delta. I go to the airport, I go sit down, and there sitting in seat 3A was Paul Ebel. I had not seen him for 50 years, and there he was sitting in a chair right next to me. So we decided that was a good omen, that we needed to do something every year together. So every year we go on a grand adventure somewhere, and that's what we're going to be doing this year again. So Paul's a great guy. Martha is his wife, Martha Ebel. He has a daughter and a son and 2 grandchildren. And like I said, he's my best friend. And Paul, it's all up to you, babe. You.
You can't imagine what it's like to not having thought about your roommate for 50 years and sitting on an airport in Atlanta, just sitting there, and all of a sudden, in he comes and sits down beside me. Isn't that amazing? So what do you say? you say, Lord, you have given Ed back to me. We've got to do things together. And so we did. And so we've been doing this for a number of years. Ed asked me to come and give you a talk on nuclear submarines. And I could give you a talk about how they're built and all kinds of stuff like that. I could give you a lot of slides on that. But I've entitled this talk, Submarine Stories from an Old Submariner. Okay? So, I served in the submarines for 7 years. These are some pictures that were taken of my submarine as it came into port and traveled around. One of them, the one on the left up there, is it's going through the Panama Canal, and you can tell there are different kinds of submarines. And they'll go to the next picture if you would. You can see that submarine is called a fast attack submarine right now, and clearly I can't show you this, and I didn't make a picture of it, but there are two different kinds of submarines. I'm not even going to pick that up. Let me fall back just a little bit, and this is not stories about submarines. This is sort of history. The first submarine that went to sea was the Nautilus in the middle 50s, and then the U.S. realized we need to create a submarine force. The Nautilus was a first nuclear submarine. And so we started building submarines like crazy. And that was about the time Ed and I were in Navy ROTC. So staffing the submarines was a big problem. And so that's the reason I majored in nuclear engineering at Rice University, got out and became a nuclear engineer pretty quickly in the submarines. That's the picture of me that you saw up there. I was lieutenant commander. I made lieutenant commander after 4 years in the Navy. And in those days, things happened fast for nuclear submariners, and it was really just delightful. But we were building submarines like crazy. What we decided was we wanted 41 Polaris submarines, missile submarines, and we wanted 60 fast attack submarines. It's 100 submarines, but the trouble is these Polaris submarines had 2 crews, blue and gold, and so the problem was staffing all this sort of thing, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about staffing in a minute. But also the problem was building them. And there were 2 major problems. Now this is going to be my first submarine story I'm going to tell you, which aside from history. There were really 2 problems we saw. One was build the submarine and the reactor. We knew how to build submarines, but we had to build the reactors and that system. And the other one was build the missile system. So they assigned 2 admirals in charge. Which one am I going to talk about here? Admiral Rickover, right. He was given the job of building reactors, and Admiral Rayburn was given the charge of building the missiles. And these 2 people, it's really a fun study to study their 2 management styles, because Rickover really liked kicking ass, taking names, and firing you, and being rude to you, and everything like that. He was an awful human being. And I'm going to tell you a number of Rickover stories here in a little while. And Rayburn, oh my God, everybody loved Rayburn. He started tea groups. Tea groups, you sit around and talk about life and how things are going and so forth. So Rayburn had to build the missile system. Rickover had to build this system. Which one of those management styles is the best? Kick Fanny or you're my buddy? Turns out both of them work. And what happened, which is just a beautiful study in management, is the missile system and the submarine power system came together with the George Washington on time in I think it was 57 or something like that, and suddenly it was together. So I did go and get an MBA after I got out of the Navy, and we studied management style, and we said, well, which kind of management style do you want? And the answer is, both of these styles work. Now let me talk about Rickover's management style. I've met Admiral Rickover a number of times, and I spent a week with him at sea on a ship that I was the chief engineering officer for, you know, and I had black hair when we went out, and I had white hair when we came back. And I'll just tell you some of the things we did, but I got to know him pretty well. But let me tell you about his style. A number of you, if you're in nuclear submarines, have met him. Here's the question. Why would I be able to say that if you're in nuclear submarines, you met Admiral Rickover? And the answer is, he interviewed every... Oh, that's right. He interviewed every officer that was coming into the submarine service. And the reason he interviewed you, and I'm going to go, again, I'm an old submariner, so I'm going to tell you an old submarine story. I'm going to tell you about my interview. I was a senior at Rice University getting ready to go into the submarine service. I wanted to go into nuclear submarines. You got to go talk to Admiral Rickover. Went to Washington, D.C. all dressed out in my midshipman uniform. I had all kinds of doodads here and there. And walked into his office, and he said, sit down. He had a chair. And this was a rumor that he had this chair, but I've sat in that chair, and I'm telling you it's true. He cut off the front legs 2 inches. And it was a plastic chair. So when you sat in the chair, what'd you do? You never could get comfortable, and he intended it that way. And so I sit in the chair, and I'm trying to hold myself up, and he says, Ebel, why are you, this is his exact word, why are you so stupid? You know, and now I knew before I went in there that this interview was going to be testy a little bit, so we're all prepared for it. And so I said something like, well, I'm not stupid. Well, then he says, then why are your grades so bad at Rice University? You know, I said, well, sir, they're not that bad. He said, they're terrible. He said, now, when you go back to school, what are you going to do? What would you say? Right. The answer is, sir, I'm going to study. He said, all right, good. Get back to school and get the hell out of here. That was my first interview. So I got the hell out of there, and he yelled at me and says, Ebel, get back in here. Yes, sir. He said, take off all those insignia on your uniform and put them on the coffee table. This is the honest truth. Put them all on the coffee table. He says, now, take your belt buckle off and put it on the coffee table. Put that on the coffee table. He said, now get the hell out of here. And I did. What do you think the purpose of that interview was? The purpose of the interview was to find out if the officers in the submarine nuclear navy would obey what Rickover said and what he wrote in the reactor plant manuals, because if we did, that reactor was safe. And that was the most important thing to Rickover. He didn't care if I was smart or dumb. He didn't care whether I slid off the chair or not. He wanted to see if I would take my uniform stuff off and leave it with him. I flew back home on an airplane with no belt and with blue serge suit, you know, and so forth. I did pass that interview, got into the Navy. You talk to other people, they've all had all kinds of different stories about Rickover, but every time he's asking you, will you violate my procedures? Isn't that kind of interesting? And that was who he was. Second story about Rickover. I was in the Navy, was assigned to Polaris submarine, and then I became an officer in an engineer qualified and was going to a fast attack. But before you become a chief engineering officer, what do you have to do? Interview by Rickover again. What, said I? Oh my God, I've been there. Okay, so I got certified as an engineer, but I had to go get interviewed by Rickover again. Got there 7 o'clock in the morning in my lieutenant suit, and I was ready to be interviewed by him, and his secretary says, sit in that office and he'll talk to you when he can. In that office was a chair and a phone book from Washington, D.C., and nothing else. This is a true story. I told you what I'm going to do up here, right? I'm going to tell you some stories. That's what I'm going to do. So I sat there and looked at the phone book long enough, and then about noon I went out and looked at his secretary and I said, I'm here. And she said, he says, wait. Okay. Went back in the room. 7 o'clock that night, I get called into his office. I walk in there and I'm standing up. He's looking at his desk. He looks up at me and he says, Ebel, how was your day? Now, that could go either way, couldn't it? You know, you could go one way or the other, but when we go in to see Rickover, now you want to pass the exam, so you want to say the right thing. We all knew what to say after that. So, Ebel, how was your day? Fine, sir. He said, good, get the hell out of here. Really, I really got to know him well. You know, those are my 2 interviews with him. And I passed. I became certified as an engineer. What did I show him? Again, as the chief engineering officer of a submarine, am I going to violate something Rickover says or that he writes? Are his reactors going to be safe? Yes. So that was my second meeting with Rickover. I started to allude to my third meeting with Rickover was when I was the chief engineering officer of a fast attack submarine. This submarine, just in one sentence, this was the Guardfish. It was at Pearl Harbor. At Pearl Harbor, if you're going into the harbor, you've got to start way out there and come up a narrow place where they blasted the coral away so you have enough water so you can get into Pearl Harbor. And the end of those 2 buoys are called Papa Hotel, Pearl Harbor. You got to go outside of those buoys and come in, or you're up a creek. Our ship came back from patrol, the Guardfish. I was not on it. And it came back from patrol and had all kinds of problems. They couldn't get the hatches open. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't navigate well. They came on a full bell on the surface, cut inside these 2 buoys of Papa Hotel and ran on a full bell up into 10 feet of water. They draw 30 feet of water for shore. The ship skidded along for a while and then rolled over on the side. Do you think that made Admiral Rickover happy? He fired every officer on that ship except the executive officer. Every officer took a hit. The engineer, the captain, the captain, I don't know, he may be a Lieutenant JG by now, I don't know. But Rickover absolutely stepped in and took it over, and he assigned all new officers, and that's when I just had become an engineer certified. I got the job of being the engineer of that ship. So that's how I got the job. We fixed up the ship. The ship was not damaged very bad. It scratched the outside of it a little bit. These ships are pretty sturdy. The hulls are 5 inches thick, 33 feet in diameter, perfectly round. Our big question in the shipyard was, did we bend that hull? Because if you bent that hull, when you go down to test depth, that ship gets squeezed in. You know the story about an egg? You know, it's hard to kind of crush an egg in your hand. So ships get squeezed in. When we went down to test depth, we often would tie a string from one side of the ship to the other side, and when we went down, that string would hang down into the ground. Because this 5 inches thick, perfectly within a quarter of an inch, perfectly round. Therefore, when it goes down deep, what happens to the steel? It just gets squeezed. All it has is compression stress in it, and this is special steel to handle compression. So therefore, that's what we did with this ship in Pearl Harbor. Make sure when we ran up on the coral there, we didn't bend it and dent it, and we didn't. So they just fixed up the outside, and off we went again. Except the trouble was, Rickover was so mad. When we got ready to go to sea, all of a sudden we got to test it. You know, the shipyard had finished this. Now we were going to go out and test it. The Navy contacted us and said, Rickover wants to go to sea with you. That ship held 10 officers and 100 men. Rickover got the executive. You don't get the captain's stateroom. He got the executive officer stateroom. The exec moved down, slept on the torpedo tube somewhere. But Rickover was there. We ate with him every day. He was in the wardroom. I mean, there's only 10 officers on there, and Rickover's on there with me. You know, what the heck is that all about? But I was the chief engineer, and he used to like to walk back in the engineering department, and every time he went back there, somebody along the way would call me and say, Rickover's in the engineering department. I said, oh my God. I'd go running back there and something would happen. The reactor would get scrammed, the power systems would go off, somebody would do something, an oil system would go bad, because Rickover would cause it, and he wanted to see how well we could manage it. That's why I told you my hair was dark before he came on board. When he left, I think it was white. So anyway, we passed that test. We were successful, and I got to talk with Rickover a while. I hated him. He's about 5 feet 2 inches tall. And he was not born in America. I think he was born in Israel, but I'm not absolutely sure. But he's born off somewhere else. Came here, and he went to the Naval Academy. And the story is he was so hated at the Naval Academy that they put perforations around his picture. So if you went to in the academy thing, if you went there and you wanted to remove him, you could easily tear his picture out and throw it away. He never made, in the Navy, you get advanced by an officer group that looks to see what kind of officer you are and if you're going to be promoted. Nobody in the Navy liked him. So it was Congress that kept upping his level to be an admiral. You know, so he was a very unusual character. And it was all because of his management style. And did it work? Yes. You know, we built those submarines. We did what we were supposed to do. Now, I've got a couple more stories to tell you. I don't want to, really, I keep Ed awake all night long telling him these stories. Ed and I were both in Navy ROTC, Ed Ebel, but he went to surface ship, and we always called them targets. Yeah, but I went in the submarines, and the thing about one of the kinds of submarines we built, which were at those days they were Polaris submarines, now they're Trident, and so forth. I'm going to tell you a fact that I think will surprise you. Gosh, what may surprise you is, do you remember years and years ago we used to have 40,000 or 50,000 atom bombs, and we signed a deal with Russia, was called the Arms Limitation Treaty, and we said we would reduce the number of atomic bombs we have to around 6,000 or 7,000. I think we both said they're atom bombs. That's probably enough, you know. Right now, let me tell you this fact that you may not be aware of. Half of all the atom bombs we have in America are at sea on missile submarines. Half. The rest of them are in Air Force bases, and they're in silos up in North Dakota and different places like that. They need to be there. The trouble with those bases and the silos is who knows where they are. Russia does, and a preemptive strike could knock those out, and then we'd be out of luck. Do they know where Polaris submarines are? No. Our Polaris submarines are so well designed, so quiet, and their job is to go to somewhere in the ocean. Now let me tell you about these Polaris submarines just for a second. They have 18 missiles on them. Each missile now holds 10 atom bombs. So this missile, when it's time to bomb somebody, the missile comes up and goes over and flies over Russia or China or wherever. Oh, and they have a range of 6,000 miles. So flies over that and then just throws out atom bombs as it goes, throws out its 10 atom bombs. It shoots 18 missiles, and we have 10 or 12 of these Polaris submarines here in the USA right now. We used to have 41, but we've reached it down to 10 or 12, maybe 15, I'm not sure. But anyhow, at any given time, about half of them are at sea, and those Polaris submarines at sea with those missiles in a place where Russia doesn't know where they are, is it a arguing point? And the answer is yes. So we in submarines, Polaris submarines, are so proud of the job we've done of keeping Cold War and keeping the peace during this Cold War time, because nobody knew where those were. So where are the Russian Polaris submarines? That's why we have fast attack submarines. I was on Polaris to start with, then I was an engineer of fast attack. We went out, and our job was to go sit on the outside of a port, Murmansk or Vladivostok. We did Vladivostok up on the high Pacific, as I recall. I think that's the name of it. Anyway, in Vladivostok, we'd sit outside that port and wait till a Russian submarine comes out. It's on the surface because it hadn't dived yet. We're down there. We're taking pictures of it. We know what the heck he looks like. Then he dives, and you know what the word is called? Trail. That was the bread and butter of fast attack submarines. So we'd start trailing that guy. My ship, the Guardfish, if you ever want to read about the most successful trail ever done, the Guardfish did it. And you can read about it in this book. And this is one of the best submarine books in the world. Can you see in the back? I don't know. The title of it is Blind Man's Bluff. Because what is a trail? It's just like the game Blind Man's Bluff. In Blind Man's Bluff, I'm not sure exactly what the rules are, but one kid, you put an eye over him, and then someone says, "Johnny," and then he tries to go find where you are, and then someone else. That's a perfect analogy for fast attacks following Russian Polaris submarines. And in the days where I was in, from 63 to 70, all Russian missile submarines at one time ended up being trailed. Now, why do we want to trail them? Because if it came down during the Cold War, if it came down to a shooting war and they were going to shoot their missiles, we were going to do what? sink them before they could shoot their missiles. And so that was our way of counteracting the Russians' missile system. Why couldn't they do that to us? The reason is, here's my next submarine story. Our submarines were, we always said when I was in the Navy, the exchange ratio, if it got down to a battle between American submarines and a Russian submarine, the exchange ratio would be 100 to 1. Why? We were so much quieter, so much better. We all wore tennis shoes. Even the clocks had a rubber grommet on them, I guess, maybe to make sure they didn't go click out into the ocean, you know. And so therefore we're very quiet, and here's a noisy submarine in front of us, and we're doing what? Trailing. That's what we did. The Guardfish had trailed a Russian submarine for over 30 days. One of the longest, best trails. This submarine came out and sat over by Okinawa, and its objective was going to be bomb Guam and some other things over there if there ended up being a war, but they wouldn't have been able to do it because we were with them. How close were we with them? You can hear a Russian submarine about, in those days, a couple of miles away. So we stayed within a mile to 2 behind the submarine. You didn't want to be 10 feet behind them. Why? You know, they could turn around and hit you. Turn around and hit you. My last submarine story I'm going to tell you is I was on the George C. Marshall, which was a Polaris submarine. This was my first submarine, and we were in the Mediterranean. And the reason we were in the Mediterranean is because the missiles we had on us in those days only had about 1,000 or 2,000 mile range. Now they've got 6,000, so you can be anywhere in the world and launch those things. But ours were only a couple thousand, so therefore we wanted to be kind of in close to Russia and Middle East and stuff like that. So we were sitting in the Mediterranean during the 6-day war in Israel. The U.S. government decided that they ought to send a nuclear submarine over off the coast of Israel just to be there in case it needs to be there. We were a Polaris submarine, but we can act like another submarine. We had torpedoes. We were bigger, but we could still be a fighting force. So we got ready to go over to the Middle East. To go from this side of the Mediterranean to that side, you have to go through what's called the Straits of Sicily. The Straits of Sicily are pretty narrow. We did not, so our submarine was 400 feet long. We did not like being in water less than 600 feet deep. You know, if you're in water just a couple hundred feet deep, you haven't got room to do a lot of cool things. So we stayed out of water. There's only in the middle of that strait under Sicily can you go from that side of the Mediterranean to this side. So we started heading that way, and suddenly we saw a Russian whiskey, which was a fast attack submarine, right there. I mean, why wouldn't they be at the Straits of Sicily? They're looking for submarines, going back and forth. And since they make so much more noise than us, they never knew we were there. We just sat here and watched him, and not watched him, listened to him go back and forth. We had to be over there. So we waited until he went like this, and then we started moving. For some reason, and he just may have had a wild urge or something, he turned around early. And when a submarine is coming right at you, the best place to trail a submarine is behind him, because that's where the propeller is and all the noise is in the engine room. And so they're making all that noise, and we could trail them, but if they're coming at you, that's the front of the ship coming to you. Even a Russian submarine is hard to hear at that. So we're going through the Straits of Gibraltar, Straits of Sicily. This submarine turns around. We are so quiet he never hears us. he hit us. We were going like this. He came right across the front of where our periscope was. It knocked off his propeller. It stuck his rudder in the side of our ship, and he had to surface because he didn't have a propeller or rudder. And we had his. We weren't damaged, but we had his rudder. Now, if I'm telling you this story, I couldn't say this story for 20 years after I got out of the Navy. We didn't want the Russians to know they had hit an American submarine because we didn't think they knew what the hell they hit. You know, they hit a rock or something like that. It's written about in this book. So I was so glad. I said, I'm going to talk to the Veterans Association in Atlanta. I can now talk about that situation. So they surfaced. We continued and watched them for a couple of days. Out came a tugboat from the Black Sea, hooked them up, and hauled them back to Russia. But the U.S. Navy didn't want us to appear that we had been damaged. So we finished our patrol. The 7-day war got over quickly. We went back through the Straits of Gibraltar, submerged, and went up to Scotland, to a shipyard up in Scotland, and surfaced in the middle of the night so no one could tell that we had a rudder stuck in the front of our ship. They got the ship fixed, and we went on, finished our patrol. And it's been kind of a fun secret that we've had in our mind all these years, not telling my wife or anything else until I read about it in here, and there it is. And it even has the name of the George C. Marshall. So my purpose today, I didn't want to give you a whole bunch of data on submarines or anything else, but just tell you a few personal stories that I thought might be interesting. And I hope that was. Yeah. Good.
First, thank you very much. That was quite entertaining. By the way, I'm in the Coast Guard, but I read a lot of naval history. Admiral Rickover was born in Poland.
Okay, good. Did you all hear that? I said he was born in Israel. No, Admiral Rickover was born in Poland, and they're taking credit for that. Good.
You want to do Q&A?
We're going to, yeah. On behalf of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association, this is a thanks, and then we're going to do Q&A. So first, our challenge coin.
Okay.
Did you want to
Thank you very much. And
second, I'm ready to talk too. We as a group at one point in time decided it would be useful to tell our stories. So this is the second volume. As my predecessor said, it's a beautiful book. It's great to read. And if you want to sleep, put you to sleep in a hurry.
That's good.
All right.
Good.
So,
and I'm glad. I want to read this about Vietnam because I wear the Vietnam medal on my uniform with 2 stars because my ship spent 3 tours in the Tonkin Gulf. There was a time when a hurricane came through. This is kind of interesting. And the U.S. Navy sent all of the new U.S. Navy ships out of the Tonkin Gulf, except for a nuclear submarine. You know, we don't care if the hurricane's going through or not, you know. So there was a time, it's kind of interesting, that where we were the only U.S. Navy ship sitting in the Tonkin Gulf, and we're kind of proud of that. Good.
thank you once again, and Q&A. Anybody got any questions, please raise your hand.
How did the rudder get stuck on the, what's a solid steel hull? I don't get it.
Excellent question, because you think if it's a solid 5-inch steel hull all the way from front to back, there's no way that a rudder could get stuck in it. Okay, if you look at the middle section there, it's perfectly round. That's 5 inches thick. As you get towards the back, the hull goes in. And get near the front, the hull goes in, and you've got just 1/4-inch steel on the outside, because there are a lot of things out there that you have to have on a submarine. One of them, and I'm going to try to answer each of these questions by 3 sentences. I've already gone 3 probably already. One of the things you have to have in a submarine are ballast tanks. That means you got to be able to blow air in it and get water out. So the way they made ballast tanks, you had 3 on the front left, 3 on the front right, 3 in the back left and right, and they were inside this, outside the pressure hull, but inside the thin metal. So what the Russians did was they stuck their rudder in our right starboard ballast tanks and ruined them. So when we surfaced in Scotland, what do you think we looked like? We were on the surface, but 1/4 of our ballast was gone. Thank you for that question. That's a good engineering question.
I have another engineering question. So when you're trailing these guys, I'm assuming you're shooting sonar or radar or something. How are aren't they able to do a back azimuth at somebody trailing them?
Great. And you know what the word assume is, right?
Makes an ass.
So, yeah, it makes an ass out of the person who asked the question. Actually, you could assume that we were using active sonar tracking them. And then it comes back. But what does he hear? He hears the ping. We never used active sonar. Ever. Unless we were in a place where nobody cared where you were. So we could only follow them by listening to them. Oh, wow. And you watch them go this way, and then you go this way, and you can hear how fast the propeller's going, and you figure what they're doing, and you're guessing how far they are. Then you kind of go this way and guess where they are, and you keep trying to plot where they are only by listening to them. That's why we were so good to have Russians so noisy, because we could track them that way. And for them, they could not do that to us. And to this day, I think that's true. Thank you. That's a good question.
The critical ratio that you referenced a while ago, 100 to 1, what is that ratio today?
Okay. That's a great question, and I have to say the title of this course is An Old Submariner's Story. So the only thing I know was what they told us in training in the 1960s, and that was 100 to 1. I think it's much lower now, but I don't know what it is. I'm sorry, I wish I could answer that better, but I just don't know.
I got a question for you. How fast would your attack subs go?
Okay, fast attack subs were, if you drop down, is that me or, I don't know. Anyway, that's right. What the published speed, they would say, is over 20 knots and below 1,000 feet. Okay, though that was the depth we could go to and the speed we did. I will tell you, we could go faster than 20 knots and we could go below 1,000 feet.
All right, another question. Of course, I was on an attack carrier, Ticonderoga, but
yeah,
we always referred to your submarines as boats, but you referred to them as ships.
What a wonderful question. And this is another story from an old submariner. In 1900, the first submarine was built. It was the Hunley. I don't mean 1900. In the Civil War, the Hunley was built. And it was hand-cranked, and it had about 5 or 6 people on it. And when they wanted to transfer it from someplace to the other, they picked it up with a crane, and they put it on the ship. So it was about the size of a lifeboat. So they called the Hunley a boat because it could be picked up and put on another ship. Then in 1900, we started building other submarines. They still were little and could be picked up. My Polaris submarine was 420 5 feet long. You know, you're not going to pick that up on anything, but we proudly in the nuclear submarine service and all submarine service call ourselves still boats, because that's how we started. Good question.
I'd like to share one Rickover story, if I may.
Yep.
I went to Officer Candidate School at Newport, Rhode Island, where the Naval War College is, 7/11, October 67. And in our class were 2 second-class guys that had to be approved by Rickover to become officers. And they were telling this story about how 6 of them had to go to be interviewed, as you were, because everybody had to be interviewed by Rickover. And there were 2 four-stripers, 2 full 06 captains that were on pins and needles telling these people that when they went in there to talk to Rickover, all the questions had to be answered with one word only. So the first guy goes in, and he's standing there at attention, and Rickover's looking at his file and looks up at him and said, "Jones, how many children do you have?" And he said, "2 boys." Rickover stood up, "Get him out." I mean, you would have thought that the whole world had come to an end.
Yeah.
And that's how he was.
Yeah, that's a good story. Another story I've heard about a Rickover interview, and it's in a book, and I'm not sure it's this one. Somebody came in there, and he said to the guy, "Hey, Johnson," and Johnson said, "Yes." Rickover says, "Piss me off." I mean, no, whether this really happened or not, but it was written in a book. So Johnson went up to Rickover's desk and wiped everything off the desk onto the floor. And Rickover said, "You're in." That's kind of a funny story. Whether it actually happened, I mean, that's more guts than just taking your uniform and stuff off.
Mark, go ahead. On your second interview, did you open the phone book?
The question is when you're sitting there in a room for 12 hours with only the Washington, D.C. phone book in there, did you open it up and look at it? Oh, yes, and there was no Ebel in Washington, D.C. at the time.
I have a question. I was a supply officer in the Navy Supply Corps school, and one of my roommates went into nuclear submarines as the boat's supply officer. But he had to go through the same course that all the line officers went through. And the rumor was that Rickover would ask you questions like, how many belt loops are on your trousers? Or how many eyelets are there in your shoes?
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah. Rickover didn't care if you knew what atoms were or neutrons or anything else. He wanted to ask you bizarre questions to see what your answer is going to be and if that answer was going to be respectful. Answering that question, you could say, "I don't give a damn how many things I've got on my belt. Why? How would you ask me that, Or you could say, "Sir, I don't know, but let me count them," that kind of thing. So he didn't care how many loops you had. He wanted to see if you were going to be obedient to his instructions.
I had no interest in being in the submarines, but I did test myself, and I got them both right.
Yeah. Good. I'll tell you one last story about supply officers. We had a supply officer that would buy all our food before we went out on a 70-day patrol. Oh, by the way, that's how long patrols are, 70 days. And you could have them we had one patrol with a Polaris submarine 140 days. But the people were going nuts. It's the people problem. They found out 70 days is about it. So you load up for 70 days worth of food. We got up and went out to sea, and that first day we had turkey roll. Oh, it comes out of a big freezer, and it was nice. The second day we had turkey roll. The 70th day we had turkey roll. It was called the Turkey Roll Patrol, and the supply officer, he just got hell from us for ordering nothing but turkey roll for us, and once you're at sea, you're stuck. So we always call that the Great Turkey Roll Patrol. Thank you.